Paul Brun from Germany. And in some cases, the adoption of those sort of international identities goes a bit further, and we'll be hearing this evening about Chung-Ling Soo, who actually had managed to fool people about his different heritage. So the people that were performing in the 19th and 20th century in London, of course, London was, you know, a vibrant and diverse city as it is now, although perhaps not as vibrant at the moment as it has been at other points. And not only were people adopting international identities, but there were sort of, well, there were practices that today we find quite jarring and unacceptable, such as minstrelsy and even, you know, black performers being part of minstrel groups. And Steve is going to talk a little bit more about those sort of perhaps more challenging elements. So we've got a lot to explore and discuss in the panel session this evening. So it may be the basis for lots of talks in the future, I don't know. This is a panel discussion, so we do want to take your questions, but we're going to be using the chat function to do that. And we're going to hear from all three presenters first, and then we'll go over to you to take the questions. And my colleague, research partner in the Brixton Music Hall project is going to be leading the Q&A session. So without further ado, I shall pass over to Chris for her to introduce the panel for this evening.
Thank you, Tracy. Can you hear me and see me of those?
I can.
Chris, and as Tracy mentioned, I'm a collaborator with Tracy on the project Music Hall Brixton and Beyond. And to kick this off, I started doing research on my family history connections to music hall and was absolutely astounded by the extent to which they were traveling internationally in the 1880s through to the early part of the 20th century. They were traveling to places that, you know, I had never dreamed that they would get. And indeed, you know, many of us don't travel that far, certainly not now. But through our panel, we're going to be, as Tracy said, we'll run the panel all together, and then we'll take those questions at the end. So if you can save up your questions, put them on the chat, and then we'll open that up. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. We're very, very fortunate tonight to have three amazing speakers who have a wealth of knowledge. The first speaker will be Alison Young. And Allison is a solicitor who's turned her experience recently into research on her own music hall family history, and particularly the line of her paternal family, all of whom were music hall performers, and she'll be going through some of that with us. Alison writes a blog about her family history research and her research on their lives. And I really urge you to go and investigate that at another time. It's, the blog is Music Hall Alice. We'll next go to S.I.Martin, and for many of you in Lambeth and in the Brixton area, you'll be very familiar with Steve's amazing work as a historian and author, specialising in Black British history. Steve, we're also incredibly busy, so we're very fortunate to have him with us tonight, talking about three particular performers, and he'll take us through that. And then our third and final speaker for this evening will be Amy Matthewson. And again, Amy's also incredibly busy, so great that she can be with us. And Amy's a research associate at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her particular interests are in visual and material cultures, race relations, representation. And Amy's going to be talking to us about famous, well, at the time he was famous, Chung-Ling Soo, and his many different deceptions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you now to Allison. Welcome, Allison.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can, good. Okay, thanks.
Can you see the presentation on the screen?
I can, it's all there. So without further ado. So thanks for that introduction, for inviting me to speak this evening. Steve, Amy and I are rather like turns at the music hall, 10 minutes each to get our material over. So kicking off, I'm going to talk about how my family's music hall experiences reflect and represent the theme of this evening's talk, International Music Hall. My enduring connection to the world of music hall is through my dad's side of the family, and more specifically through my grandma Nora. You can see a few of the family here, a collection of singers, speciality dancers, comics, soubrettes, principal boys and girls, bareback circus riders, acrobats, and there was even a roller skating champion amongst them. Nearly all of them were born outside London, in Brighton, Portsmouth, Manchester. But in the case of my great-grandfather, Larry Lewis, and his sister, Ray Maskell, they were born in the States, probably Cincinnati, Ohio, or maybe New York City. A common uniting thread for all of them was Lambeth, where they established roots. And my multi-talented performing relatives, and I hasten to add, I haven't inherited any performing genes whatsoever, were not alone in their touchdown in the Lambeth area, as we have heard on previous Musical Wednesdays. One performer in my family made the big time. Here she is. Could I have slide 2, please? Here she is, Daisy Dormer. Some of you will be familiar with Daisy Dormer Court, part of the Brighton Terrace estate in Brixton, which was named after her. The rest of the family were hard-working, reliable turns, earning a living, sometimes a fairly good one, but other times wondering what the future held. Common to many a music hall performer, alcohol played a large part in their lives, on and off the stage, and in some cases led to an early demise. What music did give this group of people was a diverse and incredibly adventurous life. Their life experiences epitomise that of performers during the late Victorian and Edwardian period and illustrate how international a life on the stage could be, particularly for the women amongst them. My significant female relatives were born into working class families, and had the lure of the stage not intervened, life would have provided little opportunity in the way of education and travel. Work would very likely have been confined to domestic service or associated with the coastal towns where their families remained. Some of you may be familiar with Sarah Waters' novel Tipping the Velvet, where Nan is an oyster girl who lives in Whitstable and who longs to escape onto the music hall stage, which she does and becomes a male impersonator. I see some of my relatives in that mould. International travel for performers in the late 19th and earliest 20th century was mainly confined to the English-speaking world and the outposts of the British Empire, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. In America, the growing vaudeville circuit provided a regular exchange of performers across the Atlantic, with the development of long-distance travel easing the process. There was also a regular influx of European performers, particularly in the worlds of magic and circus. The Berlin Winter Garden and the café concerts of Paris becoming desirable places for music hall artistes to perform. There was a constant cross-pollination of performers and performance styles. The story of my family really starts with this woman. Next slide, please. My mysterious and fascinating twice great-grandmother, Ada. She was known by numerous names and identities, stage names and aliases used to keep her out of trouble. In her 70 years, Ada was a star of circus equestrian dramas, a clown cricketer, an actress in light operetta, a dancing teacher, and a member of Fred Carno's sketch troupes. She married twice, maybe 3 times. Firstly, to the African blondin, Herr Christoph, who was described as the greatest tightrope dancer in England, and then she married an Irish contortionist by the name of Monsieur Fabian. She was almost certainly a bigamist, and her third partner, possibly husband, was a Jewish-American juggler whose identity remains a mystery, although he certainly was the father of her 2 children. Ada travelled the length and breadth of the United Kingdom performing in circus and music hall in the 1860s and 1870s. There was a lot of interchange between circus and music hall performers at that time. Towards the end of the 1870s, she travelled to the United States to perform and settled there for a while, turning her focus to the burgeoning theatrical careers of her children. And next slide, please. Here are the two children, Larry Lewis, my great-grandfather, and his sister, Ray Maskell. Ray was something of a child star in the States and played Little Lord Fauntleroy for 3 years solid in the 1890s, touring throughout America. Ada and Larry appeared in the cast in minor roles. American audiences could not get enough of Francis Hodgson Burnett's tale of Cedric and his procession from genteel American poverty to the English aristocracy. Ada and her two children were living a life that I only know thanks to American musicals like Gypsy and Funny Girl, railroad trucks, theatrical hampers, dominant mothers, and irate stage managers. In 1892, the Fauntleroy role brought Ray to the UK for a tour, and the family never really went back. They settled in digs in Brixton. Ada, Larry and Ray quickly established themselves on the halls and were soon on the regular circuit of weekly bookings and panto engagements. Ada and Larry were regulars in Fred Karno's early sketches and both featured in his production of Her Majesty's Guests at Kennington Theatre in 1900. Aspects of this production became Mumming Birds and A Night at the English Music Hall that launched Charlie Chaplin in America. During Panto in Glasgow in 1906, Larry met Violet Stockell. Could I have the next slide, please? My great-grandmother and the sister of Daisy Dormer. If anyone is familiar with Angela Carter's Wise Children, and Angela Carter was of course another Lambeth resident, I see Daisy and Violet, long-time Brixton residents, as rather like Nora and Dora Chance, the performing sisters in Wise Children who love to dance and sing. Violet and Larry married during the Glasgow Panto run, and before the year was out, were on their way to Australia for a 6-month tour. Engaged by Harry Rickards, a Croydon-born former music hall performer, now established as an impresario in Australia. The journey to Australia by steamship was then an expedition of some 6 weeks, with stopovers at Gibraltar, Marseille, Naples, Port Said in Egypt, and Colombo in Sri Lanka. Their first performances were at the New Opera House, Melbourne, moving on to Rickards' Sydney Tivoli, which you can see here in the next slide. You can see the boards advertising Larry and Violet outside the theatre, and what looks to me very much like Larry standing in front of the board on the right-hand side of the image. As well as the Australian cities, the tour amazingly also took them to far-flung places such as Kalgoorlie, a burgeoning gold rush town 370 miles from Perth in Western Australia. One can only imagine how they got there. What is interesting is who else was in Australia with them then, either on the same bill or following on the next week. Fellow Brixton residents, Harry Tate with his madcap fishing sketch, and Cassie Warmer was also there, a singer. You get the sense that walking down Castlereagh Street in Sydney may not have been too different from an amble along Brixton and Kennington roads. Familiar faces from home, and similarly, when back in Brixton, familiar faces from their travels might greet them when popping into Bon Marché. Although in the case of my family, it would be more likely they would be popping into the White Horse or some other convenient hostelry. And in their journeying throughout the UK, they were staying in theatrical digs with a vast range of performers, acrobats, jugglers, magicians, as well as singers and comedians, hailing from America, Germany, Scandinavia, and Asia. The famous American Harry Houdini appeared on the same bill as them more than once, as did Paul Cinquevalli, the celebrated German-born juggler, resident of Mostyn Road, Lambeth. Next slide, please. My link with this world, my grandmother, Nora Young, seen here in her theatrical calling card, she was known in the business by the rather more stagey name, Molly O'Day. As the child of music hall parents, like so many, she followed them onto the stage, although this was not the life they wanted for her. It was the only life she and so many others knew. She was born in Brixton, but benefited from her family's social mobility and was sent away to boarding school in Margate, paid for by wealthy aunt Daisy Dormer. She was the last of the breed. Her stage career ended by marriage and children. Next slide, please. Finally, and in conclusion, a rather basic map plotting places travelled to by my family in the period 1870 to 1925, just to give a sense of the distances covered. They were far better travelled than I am, both internationally and closer to home. Music hall is often seen as a very British tradition, as insular, London-focused, a rowdy sing-along. I hope you will agree with me that from my family experience, that cosy view was far from the truth. It was far more international in scope and presentation. And my research continues to unearth experiences and incidences that support that perspective. Okay, the end.
Thank you, Alison. That was brilliant. I'm going to hand straight over now to Steve. Steve, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Is that the thumbs up? Okay, no objections, so I'll continue. Yes, I'm going to attempt to shoehorn three fascinating lives, lives which involved lots of international travel, into the next 10 minutes. Inevitably, I'll fail, but I'm going to do my very, very best. And these lives are the lives of three individuals of African origin who found themselves in the, to our 21st century perspective, in the bizarre world of music hall, circus skills, music hall and the circus. And there will be period epithets which I feel obliged to use. So in case anyone needs any sort of trigger warnings, that was it. I will be using period language and epithets. But I'm really fascinated by the sense in sense of the performative world, the cultures that they were performing and the identities that they were obliged to assume, given the heavy input of Negro delineation, the heavy input of stylized and sentimentalized and straightforwardly racist depictions of African notions of African-American culture. This is a world where they chose to make their livings and they had to conform to very, very rigid behaviors and expectations. There's also another minor note in these three lives, which is that of child exploitation, which I really won't have time to go into, but it's something I think is often overlooked in a lot of these accounts. Okay, so what we're looking at now on Tracy Gregory's screen is the composer, the drummer, and the keyboardist, Gordon Stratton. Gordon Stratton was born William Masters in Liverpool in 1887. If you look at the image on the left, you'll see him clearly amongst his fellow street ragamuffins in this tableau, which was snapped in 1895, we're given to understand. I think it would have been a bit earlier. But yeah, here he is in 1895, when he'd have been supposedly 8 years old, which would go against the sort of myth of his rise to fame, which states that at the age of 5, this street urchin wormed his way into a musical performance and was so moved that he started joining in, emoting, singing along, whereupon he was swooped on by a canny promoter who put him into a clog dancing group known as the Five Lads. Part 2 in his progress, stage 2 in his progress, was his, joining up with Charlie Chaplin, no escape from Charlie Chaplin, in the Lancashire Lads. He also went on in 1908 to tour Britain as a member of the Jamaican Choir. he starts traveling. He travels to France, he travels to the United States, he spends time in Jamaica. He becomes a famous drummer performing all over the United States. And one of the legends goes that, you know, he is one of the vectors through which various jazz styles arrived on these shores. He also, during this period, while living in the United Kingdom, he starts performing under the title of the natural artistic coon. And one of the things which has always fascinated me about this lifestyle is how precarious it was. Could I have the next slide, please? Yep, it's how precarious this was. I mean, this is an entry from the Police Gazette of 1917, by which time our man, Mr. Stratton, was someone of some profile, yet here he is dipping and diving. You can see from this entry from the 5th of January regarding persons in custody who may be wanted elsewhere. It's a very addictive read, that periodical, I have to say. You can see that he was in custody at Barnsley and charged as Gordon Stratton. You can see his original name, and basically it's postal theft. Not the tallest of gentlemen, 5'4", and described as a man of color. But it's interesting that they mentioned that he's a musical artiste who has resided in Brixton, London, and he's been starring in the Smoke Up Review, which has been touring the provinces. So he's not out of work, but like most of these individuals, these performers, work is intermittent, so they have to turn their hands at all sorts of things, and crime, I would not imagine, was that far away. was one of their furthest interests. I wouldn't have thought so. But clearly you can see by the closing remarks that he has previous convictions. So if there's a happy ending, and there is, it's that Mr. Stratton went on to perform before the crowned heads of Europe. He ended up living in Argentina, where he died in 1982. He was known for being very refined. You know, the image of the refined gentleman that you saw on the right hand, in the right hand frame on the first screen. He became a member of Argentinian high society. He was a polo player. He was multilingual and basically very, very far removed from the urchin of his earlier years, including, if it's credit to him at all, being a close friend and a polo buddy of Edward VIII, for what that is worth. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, Belle Davis and her pickaninnies. Now, Belle Davis is being mentioned here because she was a frequent visitor to Lambeth. 1901, June, she's here for a week. 1902, March, another week. August 1917, and the Christmas of that same year, 1917, she is with us in Lambeth, of course, at the Empress. She also had a couple of appearances at, if I can commit borough libel, she had a couple of appearances in Camberwell as well. So her selling point, of course, was that she performed with these young people, her pickaninnies, as they were known, as Boris Johnson may call them, her pickaninnies. And this was her speciality. One of her specialities. Her other was the fact that she was known as an octoroon being a person of African origin of very light coloration, or who has one great grandparent who is of full visible African origin. In fact, Belle had to darken herself down in order to appeal to majority audiences who wanted to see a black woman. And it's interesting that Gordon Stratton, who we just met, described her as a tall, attractive black woman, mezzo-soprano, yes, a tall black girl. And the language is interesting here by Gordon Stratton, a native from New Orleans and very beautiful. But that wasn't why she was making her money. She was apparently not a very good singer either, even though she was advertised as the world's foremost coon cantatrice, the world's foremost coon cantatrice. But she was always flanked, as you see her in this image, by young people. These two individuals would be from her first tour in 1901, Irving Williams and Sammy Jones, one of whom was 9 years old, the other who was 7. I mean, it's incomprehensibly young to our sensibilities, and they were tambourine workers and played the mouth organ and tap danced. And again, if there's a payoff to these stories, which appear to our sensibilities as like child exploitation, it is that both of these children went on to have successful careers in continental Europe and comparatively comfortable lives given their backgrounds. Could I have the last one, please? Right, Adelaide Weyland, otherwise known as Zayo, and she was born Adelaide Chilvers in Norwood. We believe in 1866, but it could easily be 1863 or 1868. It's uncertain. And she was, it's very hard for me to say this, she was taken into the family of one Heinrich Wieland from Germany, who of course was known in South London as Henry Wieland, or Henry Wieland. And Henry Wieland presented himself at various stages as Zayo's foster father initially. She entered his household as an adopted child, as well as being her manager. And ultimately, 2 years after following Mr. Wieland's wife's death, Zayo became his wife. And if I can manage my screens, I'm not going to try and share my screen with you, but no, I don't have enough skills to get to the document I wanted. Basically, there are 2 documents which outline a couple of court cases. Adelaide and Henry were constantly going back and forth to court because they didn't pay contractors. And in case after case, especially particularly one in 1892 over the settlement of some debts to a handyman, Mr. Wieland refuses to outline or explain his relationship to Adelaide, and it's quite clearly an exploitative situation. He says that Adelaide is of no relation to him, even though he's been married to her for 2 years. They went on to have 2 children who became music hall performers themselves. He said that he wasn't even her manager, that he occasionally gave her money, and just was all by any description, astonishingly dodgy and sketchy person. But Zayo was most famously entered the public record in the 1890s because of her performances, dressed as you see her now, raising her arms in this anti-Victorian stance, and being of a fairly muscular build, as well as practicing her skills as an aerialist, in which activity she was cautioned initially by the National Vigilance Association and actually banned from performing at the aquarium by Westminster Bridge. But I'm mentioning all this, as I said, very, very rushed and very, very hurriedly, but it does fascinate me, the twofold fascination. Initially, the roles that people of African origin were obliged to perform, as well as the whole aspect of child exploitation, which first came to me when I was reading the astonishing book In the Valley of the Comedians, a very slim piece of work which describes the whole populating, the peopling of Brixton Road and its offer alleys by people in trades such as those I've just mentioned, on which point I think I should stop.
Thank you, Steve. That was fascinating. Can we move straight on, please, to Amy?
Hello, could you hear me all right? Yes, I'm hoping so.
Yes.
Thanks, Chris. So thank you to Tracy and Chris for organizing this event and for inviting me to talk. I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that I'm actually not a music hall expert. My interest lies very much, as Chris said, in representation. So I'll be talking more about Chung-Ling Soo, the performer, who did actually perform in Brixton. Tracy was kind enough to find an article on him. So I'd like to begin tonight's talk with the end rather than the beginning of the story. It was an extremely dramatic event that shocked audiences and shook the magical community in the early 20th century. And I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up.
Sorry, I managed the other ones smoothly, and I'm just struggling with this one, but I will be there in a moment. Sorry.
No problem. I'll continue.
Yeah, thank you.
So it happened in the evening of the 23rd of March, 1918, at the Wood Green Empire Theatre in London. It was the last show of the week, 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, and every seat in this theatre was filled. There was an air of excitement and anticipation for the sold-out show's headline, the world's greatest magician, Chung-Ling Soo. So to introduce the star performer, the orchestra selected a Chinese melody with gongs that provided the expected Oriental accents. When those gongs sounded, the curtains rose to reveal a silk backdrop painted with scenes of bridges and pagodas and in shades of blue and white. So there in the middle of the stage is Chung-Ling Soo. He's dressed in dark silk pants underneath an embroidered robe. His composure is calm and he is silent. This silence not only added to the air of mystery, but it was also a stamp of authenticity, what I will call his Chineseness. Frank Kamataro, his stage manager and one of his main assistants, explained to the crowd that Chung-Ling Soo could not speak English. And after almost 18 years in the British music hall industry, Chung never spoke or addressed his audience or his interviewers. So that evening, Chung-Ling Soo performed a series of magic tricks. At around 10:40, Kamatari stepped forward and addressed the audience, explaining that Chung-Ling Soo would like to demonstrate to his friends in London how he survived execution from the dreaded Boxers. So either one wants to refer to this event as the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, or the Boxer Movement, depending on your approach. This event is remembered as a violent, anti-foreign and anti-Christian movement in China beginning in 1898 and ending with the signing of the Boxer Protocol in 1901. Media reports, visual documentation, and witness accounts, along with fictionalized adventure stories for children, toys, and stage productions, sensationalized the event and removed the Anglo-Boer War from its position as leader in the British papers. So now, on stage in the Wood Green Empire was a conjurer who challenged and defeated the Boxers with his use of magic. A petite Chinese lady, Chung-Ling Soo's longtime partner, Sui Sin, she gave Chung-Ling Soo a porcelain plate for him to hold in front of himself to act as a shield to protect himself from the riflemen. So Chung-Ling Soo's on stage, he's got this porcelain plate in front of him. He puts it up and he draws a deep breath for dramatic effect. The entire stadium is silent. With a nod, he signals to Kamataro that he was ready. And with a loud crack, the shots exploded through the theater, breaking the silence tension. For a fraction of a second, Chung Ling-soo stands motionless as the waft of smokes from the barrel of the guns float through the air. Then he cries out. He reels, he twists slightly, and then he crumples to the ground. The porcelain plate smashes on the wooden stage. His assistants, seeing a pool of blood emerging from his robes, rush to him. Frantic commands echo across the stage as the curtains were lowered and the orchestra took up God Save the King to indicate to the audience that the show was over. The audience felt uneasy, but it was only with Monday morning newspapers that they understood exactly what had transpired on stage. Chung Ling-soo was accidentally shot, and he had died from his injuries. The press reported on his death and revealed with great surprise that Chung Ling-soo's identity was not a Chinese man. He was actually an American named William Ellsworth Robinson. The Daily Express reports, and I'm quoting from the Daily Express, Chung Ling-soo, who was American, aged 59, possessed a wonderful faculty of makeup and was generally accepted as a genuine Chinaman. So my particular interest is not so much on Robinson himself, but more on his representation of Chineseness and the ways in which he managed to successfully convince his British audience of his authenticity as a Chinese person. Robinson was born the 2nd of April, 1861, in New York to James and Sarah Robinson, both New Yorkers. And as a young man, Robinson billed himself as the man of mystery, started performing informally at family gatherings, private parties, picnics, or on school programs. Next slide, please, Tracy. Next one. Next. Next. Right, ooh, go back one. Perfect. So this is William Robinson, AKA Chung Ling-soo. He then worked behind the scenes and on stage as an assistant, devising illusions for big celebrity names. Next slide, please. First for Harry Keller and then for Keller's rival, Alexander Ehrman. And it was while working for Ehrman that Robinson saw Chung Ling-fu perform. Next slide, please. So Fu, who was actually Chinese, his magic was completely new to Western audiences. His tricks made headlines and his performances were always packed with people eager to see this exciting magician. In April 1900, Robinson bought some Chinese costumes, adopted the stage name Pop Sing Lu, then headed over to Paris for his first performance at the Folies Bergère. According to the magic publication Mahatma, the show was not a success. It reports, and I quote, Robinson would have made a greater success had he given an evening dress performance and exhibited some of his admirable hand and mechanical illusion, as he is out of his element in Chinese business, and the French people are so very difficult to please. After Paris, Robinson's show moved to London. He changed his name to Chung Ling-soo, deceptively similar to Ching Ling-fu. In London, Robinson managed to reinvent himself successfully as a Chinese magician. So at the end of 1904, Ching Ling-fu began to perform in London. And before his arrival, Fu's friends alerted him that his competition was apparently this amazing Chinese magician who was none other than William Robinson, who Fu knew was not Chinese at all. Next slide, please. So Fu told a reporter from the Weekly Dispatch that Chung Ling-soo was not Chinese, but a Scottish American named Robinson. He added that Robinson looked ridiculous in his Chinese robes, as it was, he says, a woman's dress. So Kamataro, his Chungling Su's agent, speaking as usual on Robinson's behalf, suggested that Fu had stolen all of Robinson's tricks and that his garments were indeed appropriate. And with this rivalry heating up, the Weekly Dispatch newspaper orchestrated a contest between the two. So the London newspapers had a field day. They gleefully came up with headlines like, "Did Fu fool Su?" or "Can Su fool Fu?" So in the end, Fu never arrived in the newspaper office. Robinson declared himself the winner, and he started billing himself the original Chinese conjurer and continued performing with great success until his death on stage in 1918. Next slide, please. So let me return to this particular point of interest of mine in the idea of authenticity and what Chineseness means to the popular imagination. While reading Robinson, the questions that continually came to mind were, how did Robinson so successfully fool the British public? What were the symbols or the signifiers of Chineseness that he used in order to convincingly demonstrate his authenticity as a Chinese man? So the questions of why Robinson would become Chinese as part of his act is more easily answerable. He was participating in the romantic and ideological dimensions of Orientalism of his time. And there was this idea that being Chinese would make him more exotic and therefore more interesting. But how did Robinson convince the public? Well, I think he knew his audience well. Robinson was well aware that knowledge of China and the Chinese, the language, the culture, was extremely limited, and he could use this to his advantage. He also used all the ideas and cultural representations of China that were so familiar and so ingrained within the popular British imagination. Next slide, please. So here are two good examples. These posters use all the elements of Chineseness. There's the peacock, there's Chinese lanterns, the pagoda in the background. Visual familiarities that one finds on the blue and white ceramic household wares that were and continue to be very popular. So these, of course, all form part of the significance of visual cultural representation as material culture in porcelain or in stage performances like Robinson's Chungling Su, making them inseparable with the construction and the widespread belief on particular sets and ideas of what it means to be Chinese. And I think I'm out of time, but I would welcome questions. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Amy. Hopefully that everyone's back on mic. But thanks. That was amazing as well. And so we've had tonight such a depth of information. But I'm going to just say, Amy, you were brilliant, managing seamlessly, going from the hiccup from our PowerPoint and technical problems right through. So thank you, and what a skill to have to manage that seamlessly. But I would like to kick off with a question, if I can, to Amy, and then we'll also ask Steve and to Allison questions as well. And Amy, you mentioned that Chungling Su never spoke during his performance or during his interviews. How did Kamataro speak for Chungling Su?
Thanks, Chris, for the question. Yes, it was a performance in itself in terms of how they were able to speak to each other. So both Kamataro, who was Japanese American, and Chungling Su, who was American, they spoke perfect English. So in order to keep up the performance, the interviewer would ask Kamataro a question. Kamataro, who spoke no Chinese, would then turn to Chungling Su and speak in gibberish. And then Chungling Su would very seriously nod his head, and who also didn't speak Chinese, would then say something in gibberish back to Kamataro, who would then translate back to the interviewer. And so they did this continuously throughout all their interviews.
That's incredible. Just while Amy gets her breath back, I'm just going to pose a question back to Alison, if I can. Alison, fantastic, amazing, and what a family, my goodness. I did have a question come through around, you know, they travelled so much. They must have had an amazing amount of baggage and all that luggage to take with them. Did you ever find out whether they had baggage men or people travelling with them to help with their luggage?
Well, I just don't think that they were wealthy enough to actually have that. I think they just took all their own. They did it all themselves, I think only really the very top stars, the Dan Lenos, the Mari Lloyds, could afford that sort of support. I mean, what I did discover was that my great-grandmother, when she travelled to Australia for that engagement with Rickard, she was actually 7 months pregnant. She was 7 months pregnant when she got to Sydney. And she went on stage. I don't know how she disguised the fact of her pregnancy, but she was indisposed a couple of weeks later, and she gave birth to the baby, and 2 days later the baby died. So while she was there, she buried her child, but then just a very short time after that, she was back on stage again. She had to get going on to the next engagement. Couldn't afford not to. So that was a rather roundabout way of answering the question about baggage. It was physical baggage she was carrying.
Certainly brings home the stark realities, particularly of women who were travelling so far and without the support of the wider family network. Thank you. We'll come back to some more questions, Alison, but if I can go to Steve. Thanks, Steve. Incredible run through some amazing and in-depth issues so brilliantly. You mentioned really throughout the presentation the issues around child exploitation and the sort of racialized performances that cut across all of them. I was just wondering, just on the child exploitation issues, just to touch on what the sort of levels of financial remuneration were, and how, if you had any instances of how that was transferred as they got older. You mentioned the success, later success. So was there any sort of remuneration as they were growing up?
I've heard some stories, which I'm trying to recall. Jeff Green writes about this subject particularly well, the historian Geoffrey Green. He gives very interesting accounts of a lot of these young musicians. And remember, there's been a tradition, particularly of young African-American performers coming over and performing for European audiences, either as gospel singers or in young children's bands. This has been going on for a long time. And in fact, Belle Davis herself, one account of her arrival in Europe states that she had been specially commissioned or authorized by the American government to train and to stage children's shows. I would be very surprised indeed. I don't know the full details of how people were paid, but I'd be very surprised indeed if they were getting their due. And without wanting to appear at all even-handed when talking about a subject of this gravity, it can always be said that by and large, some of these individuals had lives or ended up leading lives which were in material terms much better than those they left, particularly those in the United States, and definitely Gordon Stratton's, and probably poor Zaio as well. Adelaide Chilvers, born in Norwood, who ends her days living at number 12 Stockwell Park Crescent, house still there, of course. And cold comfort, yes, but I think that many of them who did manage to make careers for themselves would have seen that as payment enough. But psychologically, what they were going through, it's hard to imagine.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that stands out is, you know, what the living conditions of those children, young people must have been like when were at the time they were going through it. And I don't imagine, although I'm sure you can enlighten us, whether they were living in the same sort of living space. Were they?
Oh no, there are some horrific stories. Particularly in the East End music halls, Poplar was notorious for having a particular property on Crisp Street, which was empty. It was bare. And it was a place where, I mean, it was, in modern parlance, they busted the property on a couple of occasions because they found there are up to 40 people, usually all black people, interestingly, black performers. And during the whole post-Zulu fascination, there were large numbers of young black men who are supposedly Zulus living in this Crisp Street property. And there are instances of people running away as well. Again, Jeff Green documents this quite extensively, but it must have been miserable, as I think the digs that these touring performers would have had to endure would have been grimy, and, you know, chevrons of slime everywhere and just rack-rented leprous sort of accommodation. So, but they were made of tougher stuff than us.
Thanks, Steve. Just to go back to Amy, if I can. Amy, it feels that we should offer you that opportunity to go back to your PowerPoint slides that we missed out on. Can I pop them up and you can just give us a bit of a run through those early ones?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. Here we go. I think you take it from where you're comfortable at, but I'm just going to wind it right back to the beginning, if I can. Here we go. And we'll just, while I'm just getting that ready, somebody also asked, did they ever expose Chung Ling Soo?
It seems that he was known to not be Chinese in America. And in Britain, he seems to have passed himself off as a genuine Chinese person, although the music hall community, managers and some assistants, they did know, but it was a very small community that knew.
Great. I'm just going to put this up. If you can, when you see it, let me know.
All right.
Do you have anything on your screen?
I don't, no.
No.
Okay.
If there was somebody in particular that wanted to take a look, they could email me and I'd be happy to send along the PowerPoint.
I think we might have to do that, Amy. Thank you very much.
I'll put in the chat, my email address on the chat.
A few technical hiccups along the way, but thanks. Great. Well, unbelievably, we've just got time for one more question. The hours run so quickly tonight. And one of the questions that's run through is, one theme running through the talk seems to be the influence of the British Empire and related to that racism on the stage. Are there examples of music hall as an anti-racist force, or at least a force for progressive working class consciousness rather than reaction? Would any of our speakers like to have a go at that one?
You need to unmute, Steve.
Unmute. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I'll definitely have a go. That's an ambitious question.
You've only got a minute.
Okay. I'm still old enough to remember the black and white minstrel show on Saturdays, hence my pause. Yes, of course, this was a world in which people would be meeting strangers. They would be meeting others. They would be seeing say Walker and Williams at the Kennington Theatre. They'd be seeing Belle Davis, and even though they were in very over-stylized European notions, carrying European notions of blackness, there would still be some level at which they would be understanding their art, their skill, their prowess at various art forms and performance, which would have broken some of the ice of Edwardian Britain.
Fantastic. Thank you for your succinctness. We're right on time, so I think we'll wrap up. And again, thanks to all the speakers, to Alison, to Steve, and to Amy for amazing, just a tiny dip into this world. And we recognise that we've only been able to just skim the surface. And we'd love to thank you, all of the speakers tonight, but also to everyone for joining us. And for those of you who've been able to join us in the earlier presentations over the last 5 weeks. This is our 5th talk in the series. All the talks have been recorded. We will shortly be putting them up online, and we'll be sending you an email with the links so that you can have a look back on those talks you missed out. But also we'll be putting out, well, you'll have the email, but we're putting information up there about potential future talks that we'll be doing. We've been really humbled by the positive support for this program over the Lambeth Heritage Festival for Music Hall Wednesdays, and it's really signalled an interest in this area. So we're going to be thinking very hard about how we can continue that. I'd also like to thank all of our other guest speakers that we've had across the series. That's for Sue McKenzie, Bill Linsky, Charlie Holland, and of course, Alison, Steve, and Amy this evening. Also the organisers of the Lambeth Heritage Festival, and you know, who without this, giving us this opportunity to have a series of talks, we wouldn't have been able to explore so many things. And you know, Lambeth Archives, of course, have been such a rich and treasured resource for all of us in so many ways. Before we go, I'd just like to remind everyone to check in again with our Layers of London. I don't know if Tracy can help share her screen on that one, but our
I'm sorry, my PowerPoint has just failed altogether, which is why I apologise to Amy, because that's why I couldn't share her slides. So
that's okay. No problem, Tracy. I'm sure we can get by without that. Layers of London, if you just Google that, for those of you who don't know, we have Music Hall Brixton and Beyond, a lovely collection there with stories that we've been putting up along with Sue and Charlie, and we would love you to visit that and to have a look at some of those stories, and also to let us know any stories that you have, and or uncovered histories, family histories, like Alison's amazing history. And we want to keep this going. Hopefully you do too. And we're going to now say goodbye and thank you again. So from Tracy and myself.